It is so wonderful. Melissa is extraordinary. Can we please hear from Melissa? I am here to share with you a few of my thoughts, but really to have a conversation. We are going to have a conversation with these extraordinary leaders and educators. But I just want to start by thanking everyone here, all the educators in the room. You know, it is personal. It should be personal for everyone in our country, and certainly it is personal for me. I mean, I will share with you part of my my experience with educators is my first grade teacher, Mrs. Frances Wilson, God rest her soul, who attended my law school graduation. She attended my law school graduation. And so many people that I have talked with over the years who have achieved any level of success, be it just success because they accomplished their dreams, whatever those were, be it success based on whatever title or salary. So many of us, we can certainly point to just two things really usually that led to that success. Our parents and, you know, our grandparents and aunties and uncles, the families that raised us, and our teachers. And because those are the two groups of people who are raising our children. And on this issue of teacher pay, the issue then is one of whether or not we as a society are valuing, are we attributing value to, are we honoring the significance and importance of our teachers, not only in terms of their awesome profession and what they do to train and prepare for that profession, but also what they do to invest in the future of our country through the skill of their profession. So it is through that lens that I think about the issue of teacher pay. And it is through the lens of also traveling our country and meeting so many teachers who are working 2 and 3 jobs, meeting professors and teachers, and thinking also about the school, the educational community, because I also do think about it in that lens, which is, it is teachers, it is our school bus drivers, it is the folks working in the cafeteria, it is the folks who clean the schools, who are all part of that beautiful ecosystem of education of our children. But I decided let's start with teacher pay. And so, why? Well, because, again, I've met so many teachers who are working 2, 3 jobs to pay the bills. In our country, 94% of teachers who teach in public schools are coming out of their own pocket to help pay for school supplies. You look around and you recognize that also we have a system, and let's have that conversation today or another time, about how upside down our system of funding school districts is, in that so much of a school district's funding is based on the tax base of that community. And of course, that tells us logically that for those communities that have a low tax base, a low purchasing power, they will have the fewest resources, even though they are often the highest need communities. So across the board, we are not doing enough to invest in the future of our country. And that really ultimately is what this topic is about, investing in the future of our country. So I have proposed what will be the first in the nation ever federal investment in teacher pay to close that teacher pay gap, which nationally is that teachers make 11% less than similarly college-educated professionals, which is on average nationally $13,500 a year. Here in South Carolina, it's just about $10,000 a year. And let's be clear about what $10,000 a year represents. $10,000 a year represents a year's worth of mortgage payments. $10,000 a year represents a year's worth of grocery bills. $10,000 a year represents putting a significant dent in student loan debt, which is one of the greatest barriers to teachers staying in the profession, because they got that heavy student loan debt and the bills to pay, and they're paying for school supplies, and on the salaries they're making, it is not all achievable. And on that point, I'll say this. I want that the kinds of incentives we create as a society are the incentives that are about investment in the people. And investment in the people. So let's think about this. There are, in colleges around our country, students who are excelling in science, who would love nothing more than to pursue their passion of teaching a middle school student the wonders of science. But when they sit down and look at their student loan debt, when they sit down and look at the cost of living, they recognize they can't make ends meet. So instead of going on to teach, they may go and take a job with a pharmaceutical company. Well, that's not the kind of incentives we want. A student who is excelling in math, who would love nothing more than to share with a high school student all that math can expose and all that math can discover. But yet they look at all the expenses they're going to incur upon graduation, and that student decides, oh, I got to go take a job on Wall Street instead of teaching in a high school, which is what would be my passion. So these are the realities that we have to acknowledge about the incentives that we are creating, the disincentives we are creating, and that these are not only a question about where we are in terms of just how we actually think about and prioritize education, but these are also realities in terms of an investment in our future or a lack of investment in our future, which will be to our collective peril. So that's how I think about all these issues, and I'm happy to open the conversation then, but I'm really now looking forward to our panel discussion so we can get into the nitty-gritty. So there we are.
Well, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Let's give her a round of applause, everyone. You're championing teacher pay, and the reality is we are, again, at a significant point in South Carolina, in Columbia, South Carolina. Tomorrow is going to be a humongous day for our teachers to stand up for their rights. And today we have 3 amazing local South Carolina-based teachers who are working every day to be our heroes, to build the foundation for tomorrow. So I'd like for us to start the conversation by throwing it to you.
Okay.
I'm appreciative of you being here, looking for local solutions to this national challenge.
Yeah.
So let's start with you, Kelly. Tell us a little bit more about what you see in terms of the research that you're seeing and some of the solutions that you'd like to bring to the forefront for Senator Harris today.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for having me. As you mentioned before, I worked for 8 years in the public school system. I taught from 4th grade all the way up through 12th grade. I have taught students with various types of learning disabilities. But one of the things that I began to realize I was becoming more and more frustrated with in my teaching career was that I often saw students coming to school who had been identified as having a certain type of learning disability, and I would then look at their background and I would say, well, I don't know that I would necessarily call this a disability, and I started trying to frame it in my mind and to other teachers in the school as this is really more of a learning difference. And the more I taught, the more years that went by, and I really started paying attention to what was going on, especially with kindergarten students that were coming up through the system, as I finally looked up one day and I said, these students aren't learning disabled, and I don't even know that these are learning differences. These students are learning disadvantaged. Yeah. Because I'm having students coming to me who come from backgrounds where no one has read to them from the time they were born, not because they don't want to or because they don't care, but either because they just don't know that's important, or they don't have the time because they're working to keep the lights on or to buy groceries. And so then what happens is you have students coming to school, and the teacher in the classroom is not only having to be a teacher, but she's trying to be also a parent and a counselor and a nurse and a friend and so many other roles. And so when we talk about raising teacher pay, when we talk about what teachers need, I think that apart from more money, which of course absolutely helps, is maybe just a move towards a greater understanding and more of a respect for what we're asking our teachers to do every day, and then compensating them for that.
That's right. I couldn't agree more. And for years I've worked on an associated issue, which is the issue of children who are growing up in extreme poverty, or children who are growing up in a community where they go to sleep hearing gunshots at night. And what that means in terms of a child's exposure to traumatic events and undiagnosed, untreated trauma. because it's a very real issue, and it is happening again. You know, listen, poverty is trauma-inducing. Not to mention being exposed to violence, having had a family member who was killed, having attended repeated funerals for somebody who died because of gun violence. All of this is trauma-inducing. And we have so many children who are exposed to trauma, but we do not have a system, a comprehensive system in place to diagnose and treat that trauma. And it leads to predictable outcomes, which is those children have just anything that we would talk about around PTSD, right? They are in the classroom experiencing and reliving that traumatic event and acting out as a result. They're not able to concentrate. They might miss school, or they may act out, and they quickly then get branded and sometimes even self-identify as the bad kid, when in fact it's a whole other thing which has nothing to do with their capacity to learn. And our teachers end up then not only in all of the things that you have talked about, become, you know, mental health providers. I did years ago a training for teachers back when I was district attorney of San Francisco on this very issue, because I was working with some folks who've been working on, there's a woman by the name of Nadine Burke, Dr. Nadine Burke. I highly recommend her book, The Deepest Well, and she's been doing studies of children exposed to trauma and physiological health outcomes, and of course the outcomes in terms of classrooms. And so I did a training for teachers in my community at the time and I brought in pediatric psychiatrists who talked about this post-traumatic stress disorder in these children. And all of a sudden, you could put labels on what teachers are experiencing every day around diagnosable issues. And so I think that there's so much that we must do in recognizing the failure of the system across the board to support what teachers need to be able to do in a classroom, which is teach and be able to address all these other issues. When I was growing up, we had a nurse. You know, teachers are nurses, they're conflict resolution specialists. The teachers are figuring out, why didn't you come to school yesterday or the day before, and doing all of the interventions that are about family interventions. And it's asking too much, and God love a teacher. Because anybody that sticks with this profession, as so many do and have for generations of children, with very little in terms of award or societal reward, I praise and I thank our teachers for the work you do. Really do.
Yes.
Really do.
And so I'd like to turn it to Dr. Cooper next. She's got a very unique perspective, being our 2002 South Carolina State Teacher of the Year, as well as now leading Richland 1 in some very innovative programming for what happens outside of the classroom. So Traci, we'd like to hear from you. What are some of the things that you've seen and some solutions that you'd like to definitely elevate to this conversation?
Thank you, Senator. Thank you so very much for having this caucus with us. I come from a unique perspective because after I graduated from Georgetown University, I decided to go into broadcast journalism. So I flew up to New York, and my parents packed my apartment, and we got into the Big Apple, and I started my career in broadcasting. But I was troubled because I continued to be assigned stories that negatively depicted our youth.
Yeah.
And there was this dichotomy because I was hearing all these wonderful stories from my parents, who were both public school teachers, about all the great things that were happening in our public schools. And then I'd get in the newsroom every single day. And my news director didn't want to hear any of the best stories about our youth. He wanted those stories that showed the grid and the underbelly of what was going on for youth in America. And so I got on the phone on a lonely subway ride back into Manhattan, and I said, Mom and Dad, I wanna come home. I want to change careers. I wanna go upstream. I wanna help and be part of the solution for our youth. And they said, we'll be there tomorrow. We'll pack you up. We'll get up to New York. And the rest has been history. And I've been able to dedicate my life to public education. But that has been my dream fulfilled. You were talking about dreams deferred. But so many teachers and young people out there want a career in education, but they've got to decide, do I want to follow this dream and be bridled with debt? Or do I use my biology degree in order to go into the private sector, to pharmaceutical or research, or go into medicine? And that should not be the reality. I currently serve on 3 college boards here in our state. Voorhees College, the University of South Carolina Education Foundation, and Clemson University Senior Education Advisory Committee. And all 3 of those institutions, I share that because they're all tackling the same issue. We are seeing less and less young people choosing to go into colleges of education. So I want to talk with you today about your vision for building that pipeline, because if we're talking about having a competent and caring and present teacher each and every day, the supply is dwindling up. What do we do?
So part of my teacher pay initiative will actually give higher salaries to teachers that are teaching in rural communities and in high need communities, also sometimes referred to as high risk. And for that very reason of creating the incentives and understanding that what they're putting out is so great that they need to obviously be compensated in terms of giving them the resources they need to perform the work. There is also a component of what we are doing that is focused on HBCUs. I am a proud graduate of Howard University. That was a shameless plug. Thank you, Bison. But if you look at it in terms of also the communities most in need, we can look at our traditionally Hispanic education institutions, our HBCUs, and we know that in communities of color in particular that are also low income, that we have a dearth of teachers who are in those communities, and we need to create incentives. And we also know that, for example, that if a black child has a black teacher before the end of 3rd grade, they are something like 13% more likely to go to college. If they've had 2 black teachers during their elementary school education, that number almost doubles. So part of what my initiative will do is provide incentives also for HBCUs to strengthen their teachers' colleges as part of what we need to do to build the pipeline, to your point, around getting teachers who can serve in those communities and be effective in those communities, and for whom we will see great returns on that investment. Yeah.
And so we're going to throw it back over to Melissa next. And Melissa, you've got a very unique perspective as well, so love to hear a little bit about that, and specifically talking about some of the solutions or challenges that you've identified even in your intro today.
Teachers or students face?
Either one.
Yeah. Whatever perspective you'd like to share.
Enlighten us.
Just because here's the thing. There's a lot of issues in South Carolina in teaching. There's just a lot. So
You're in a church, just preach.
Yeah. I'm originally from Dillon, South Carolina. Everywhere I go, I gotta tell everybody I'm from Dillon. So that's the first thing you need to know about me. I'm from Dillon, South Carolina. What? There you go, right there. Go Wildcats, right? We have 10 state championships in Dillon, South Carolina.
Got it.
So there we go. So it's a rural community.
Yeah.
When Barack Obama came in 2008, he made a promise to invest in infrastructure in our state. And he kept that promise, except for our governor at the time sent the money back 3 times. That's why you don't vote Republican. There you go. Don't vote Republican. Because we still pay taxes on that money that went over to California, by the way. California took the money, but we didn't. But we finally got the money in Dillon for a new J.V. Martin High School. Well, J.V. Martin Middle School. It used to be J.V. Martin High back in the day. Because he put the funds in the USDA budget. And the USDA secretary at the time, or the secretary at the time, took the money, provided a low-cost loan to Dillon, and we were able to get the school. But we had to go around the world to get this money for a school that you would think our government would want. Okay? So your plan, I am very glad that you said when you are going to create a federal budget that you were going to do that in block grants that was going to be specifically earmarked for teacher pay.
Yeah.
And they couldn't do anything else with the money.
Right.
Because we know in South Carolina, they will do something else with the money.
That's right.
It's truth.
That's
So thank you. Mm-hmm. Thank you for thinking ahead. That's what women do. We always think and prepare ahead. And I'm not saying that the former president did not do that, but, you know, as women and we lead our households, we always have to think about the what if, the rainy day, if the money isn't over here, where are we going to find it? So thank you for that, but specifically for teachers. If teachers have more money, they don't have to work a second job, and they can spend time making teacher word charts in elementary school or reading to students. When my daughter was in elementary school, I thank God, because she had 2 great teachers. She has a lot of great teachers, but she had really 2 great teachers that influenced her to this day in 4th grade and 5th grade. And I still send them pictures of my daughter like every month, because I have their cell phone numbers. Now I teach. They would get out of school at 2:30. I get out of school at 2:15. And if she needed to stay for extra time, those teachers would stay for extra time with her. And I would say, now I'm in West Ashley, you know how traffic is, it's going to take me an hour to get there. Let her stay as long as she needs. My child would sit with those teachers until 5 o'clock.
Yeah.
Because that's who she was, and they would sit with her. Now, that was 10 years ago. If the teachers who work with me on job 2 or work job 2 wanted to stay with their children till 5 o'clock to help them with the reading lesson, they don't have that option because they have to work the second job. The sheer fact that if we increase teacher pay, they get to spend the time doing what they love, helping children. It's a simple thing. It's a simple thing. But when I did talent development model through Johns Hopkins, the first thing they did, if you developed their models, you had to give teachers a $5,000 raise under that model. Because they understood that if teachers were working other jobs, they weren't planning. They weren't doing their team meetings. They didn't have time in the afternoon to be innovative. And I'm going to keep going back to these charts because this 23-year-old girl spends time making charts for fun for her elementary school class. That's what teachers want to do. They're in it not to get rich, not to live a lavish lifestyle, but they're in it to help your children. And when they are forced to spend time not helping the kids that they want to help because they have to work a second job, our children don't benefit from that. They're at a disadvantage.
That's right. So since we unveiled our teacher pay initiative just last week, I got an email from my middle school teacher, Mrs. Wayne, who I had not talked to in decades. But to this point, she wrote this beautiful note, and she mentioned she remembered my best friend. She went on to talk about specific things. And that's who teachers are. I mean, truly, that's who teachers are. They take an interest in every one of their students, and that takes emotional energy. You can't be tired. We all know that. We know that with our family members, right? When we're well rested, we can really see everybody and spend time and interact and engage. When we're tired, not as much. And it is those interactions that teachers have with students that capture those most special moments that really help those students know that they are being seen and heard at the most critical phases of the development of a human being. And the other fact is that I've seen studies that tell us that children actually spend more of their awake hours with their teachers than they do with their parents. So when we think about it again, when we're talking about the value of those moments, those minutes, those hours, that time, are we actually investing commensurate with the actual value of that time that is being spent? And I will also say, you were talking earlier about early education. I actually am of a belief that we need to get to a phase where, in my mind, early education starts with birth and certainly kindergarten through the end of 3rd grade. Because if you talk about a very specific phase of life and a specific phase in terms of the education of a child, you know, and we all know that there's so many things you can measure by where a child is at the end of 3rd grade, in terms of their reading level, in terms of so many other things. And so I think about that too, and the value, again, of the person who's spending the most waking hours with that child during those years. It's our teachers. They're invaluable. So.
And Senator Harris, I think I mentioned it when we got started. My connection to the education system is that I love a man who dedicates his every minute to not only loving his family, but working hard in the classroom to provide for the next generation. And oftentimes he receives a lot of lack of support from friends who care about him, and they're constantly trying to recruit him for opportunities outside of the classroom. He stays because he recognizes that it's the impact that he's making every day that makes a difference. But it's challenging for him as a male in a woman-dominated and primarily a white woman-dominated environment to feel like he is valued, and he comes home exhausted, but he gets up every day and he keeps going, and he knows that those differences that he makes in the ways that he can kind of nod his head or, you know, make a look and get those guys in check, that nobody else can do that. And so the reality is the value is, again, we've all said it, it's not about the dollars. But there was a time when we looked at teachers and we uplifted them. This is a time where we look at teachers and we say, shame on you. Well, thank goodness you do it, because I sure don't have the patience for that. And the fact that that stigma exists it's just despicable. So you want to talk a little bit more about that piece?
I do. And I think it's important that we look at the important points that you're raising in historical context, which is teaching was always thought of as a woman's profession. And there's no coincidence between the low pay and that fact. You know, let's speak truth. Let's speak truth, right? And so, you know, and you can look at, you know, I could go on, but I won't do it right now, but of various professions which have traditionally been so-called women's professions, nursing being another example, where women have not been paid their value, because that is just true, and then we can go on to talk about pay equity across the board, including in the C-suites of corporations. So there is that part, as we're issue spotting what you are describing. And so we have to acknowledge and address that. We have to acknowledge, and I will also say, because for a very long time in the history of our country, if a woman was college educated, there were really only 3 professions. It was teaching, it was being a nurse, or a secretary, which is what that was called at the time. And so there is that, and about pay equity. There is the fact also, as it relates to men in the profession, I'm gonna, off the top of my head, I think it's 3% of teachers are black men. That's about right. And we've got to deal with that. Because, of course, a much greater number than 3% of the students that are being taught in public schools are young black men and boys. And it is very important that people see a reflection of themselves in those years when they're developing a sense of their identity and their capacity. And so part of the way that I think about this is what we need to do to create incentives for men and also for men of color, black men, Latino men, to be in the profession in a way that we can change those numbers, because we know it will actually have an impact on our capacity to educate these bright young minds. So these are the ways that I think about it.
Thank you for that. I want to go back to the conversation around rural schools and make sure that we don't skirt that. The reality is, of course, South Carolina has some major issues in all of our schools, and particularly the challenges that exist in our rural schools. Talk a little bit more about the focus you have specifically on the corridor of shame and other areas in the rural community. And then I'd love for you all to chime in, because even with Richland 1, we definitely represent some rural schools right here on this panel as well.
Well, I've been, in my visits to South Carolina, increasingly learning, and I've been reading for quite some time before then, about the corridor of shame. And it is aptly described. And it's shame on us for not putting the resources into a very defined area and strip of an area, and what has not happened, and predictable outcomes as a result of not funding things like education and paying attention to that. In terms of rural America, then, part of, again, our teacher pay initiative is that we will actually create even higher salaries for teachers who teach in rural communities. Because, again, in rural communities, teachers are leaving because there are just no resources of any sort. And, again, with the bills that have to be paid. But an associated issue is broadband.
Yes.
And again, the realities of what is required for a child to learn in the 21st century is they need access to technology. And I see Ms. Clyburn here, who has been a leader in our nation on this very issue of rural broadband. And so we look at it in terms of what we need to do to invest in rural broadband. I'm of a mind, I'll try not to get too much in the weeds, but that it's not only about laying the tracks for broadband, we also need to think about diversifying it, and where it's difficult to lay the tracks, have the satellite technology. So there's all that. But right now in rural America, children have to go to the library, if there is a public library, with any distance with which they can actually reach it, to stay there for hours at night when they would otherwise prefer to be at home, having dinner at home. There are real obstacles to a child receiving the benefit of the education if they do not have access to the technology. Because gone are the days when so many of us were taught, and we were learning math and we were learning cursive. Cursive's not even taught now, pretty much, right? And technology is the way that children can benefit from their education, but if they're not having access. So rural broadband is another piece of that. And I'll add another piece, again, around the ecosystem of what is necessary for a child to receive the benefit of what's happening in the classroom. And that also has to do with healthcare. The leading reason that children miss school and are truant is dental care, is a sore tooth, or sore gums, right? The tooth is not alive, but it's about dental care. Let's talk about if a child, if they've not been tested for vision, and what that means in terms of their ability to learn or not learn, and then them deciding, or somebody else deciding, they don't have the capacity to learn, when in fact the simple matter is that they just don't have the capacity to see. Not that they don't have the capacity to learn. Or let's talk about hearing and all of those things that are physical health issues that when you don't have access, like many rural communities do not, to affordable and accessible health care, become barriers to the education of those children. And so when I think about rural communities and education, that is the lens through which I think about it. It is about supporting teachers. It is about how you fund those communities in terms of their education system overall. It is about broadband and technology. It is about healthcare. Those are the primary ways in which I think about it.
I think that's good. And Kelly, I want to come back to you. You're doing some innovative research, but you also have some great experience as an 8-year educator in Title I schools. And so we've been talking a lot about poverty and the challenges that exist there. But I'd like for you to dig a little bit more and share a little bit more of kind of what you've seen and what you're looking forward to when you go back to the classroom in the fall.
Yeah, absolutely. So the last 5 years that I taught in a Title I middle school in Greenville County, I decided to leave the classroom about a year after our oldest child was born for a variety of reasons, but knew that I still wanted to work in education in some way, and it just so happened that at that time There was a new innovative initiative that was getting ready to kick off in Greenville that was a partnership between the United Way of Greenville County and the Social Innovation Fund. That initiative is called On Track Greenville. And what it does essentially is to implement various types of interventions in Greenville's Title I middle schools to try and keep kids on track toward an on-time high school graduation. Because research shows that in general, what we call in my office, the ABCs are typically good indicators of whether or not a student will end up dropping out. And by ABCs, I mean attendance, behavior, and course performance. So as you said, attendance really pretty early on can be a good indicator about how a student is going to end up doing in school long term and whether or not they're going to end up dropping out. And what research shows, again, is that many times it's things that most of us take for granted about being able to address. Without going into a lot of detail right now, one of the things that program is doing is implementing school-based health centers in the schools where a nurse practitioner can see students for types of issues that maybe your typical school nurse couldn't. They have the ability to communicate with a physician via a telemedicine cart. They can have sports physicals there. They're working on getting vaccinations in the schools, things that again would normally prevent students from being at school. There's a mental health component, which you spoke to earlier, and several other components as well. And so I've been working on the research and evaluation side of that for the past 4 years and have been really encouraged by what I've seen. Unfortunately, as you might guess, all of that costs money. It costs a lot of money, and the money's going to run out soon, and there are people in Greenville that are working really hard trying to figure out how to continue it. But it's really also a matter of getting people in the community to understand that these types of issues aren't just teacher issues or school issues. They are community health issues. That's right. And that's something that affects everyone. And so if we want more students graduating from high school and contributing to the economy and becoming productive members of society, then investing in their education and in their health early on is where it starts. And I say to people all the time, forget whether or not it's the right thing to do. I happen to think it is the right thing to do just from, a human being perspective. But it also just makes economic sense in the long run. And so after working on that project for the past 4 years, this past August, I had always said I'd go back to teaching. I just wasn't sure when. And when it was the night before the first day of school this past August, I just sat up and cried. And my husband said, "Honey, maybe it's time." And I said, "I think you're right." So I'll be going back to teaching middle school in the fall. And because, as you said, at the end of the day, we are doing some of the most important work there is. And while there are a lot of difficulties that come along with that, I realize that ultimately at the end of the day, it's where I want to be, where I feel called to be. And there aren't a lot of professions where you get to get in your car at the end of the day and said, I did a whole lot of good stuff for a lot of people today.
And we talked about the kids getting out of school and having to go to the libraries, and it's the time that when school gets out and teachers do go home to their families and to work on their lesson plans for the next day, that some mischief, some things can happen. And so I'd like for you to talk a little bit more, Dr. Cooper, about the things that Richland 1 is doing in terms of what happens when they get out of school. What are some innovative things that you like to point out and make sure Senator Harris knows about?
Senator Harris, I'm so proud to recognize the work that Richland School District 1 is doing. We are the 5th largest school district here in South Carolina, and our school board, our superintendent, they are utterly committed to extended day learning, extended year learning. We have 21st century grants to make sure that Monday through Friday our children are engaged in project-based learning, and that they are going on very innovative field excursions, and that we have tutors and mentors to support them. But at the federal level, our current president and our chancellor of schools is cutting AmeriCorps dollars for mentorships and 21st century funding. So when you talk about creating a safe haven between the hours of 3 and 6 p.m., helping our working families and inspiring learning, how are we going to do that when we don't have those critical funds? So I just want to take a moment to recognize our school board commissioners who are in the audience, our former chancellor of state schools, Anya Cinnabon, who was very committed during her leadership. Commissioner Bishop and Devine and Anderson, who are here, but they get it. They understand that learning doesn't end at the end of the day, and that we must have the funding and we must have the political punch and the courageous leadership to be able to have these opportunities for our students. So I just want to say publicly, I thank you for standing up for teachers. I thank you for, as I mentioned backstage, for protecting our profession, because right now I am appalled. Okay, and I might get in trouble with my supervisors here, but Senator, I'm appalled that teachers, 65,000 teachers here in South Carolina, and millions across America, and we have an ambassador for schools who does not represent us nor stand behind us. That's a problem. I've never had the opportunity to meet Ms. DuVos. I'd love to sit down and engage in a conversation with her, because when you represent teachers, we need you to be on the front lines, to stand up for us, to stand up for our children, to stand up for this profession. So I just want to thank you for doing that.
No, look, I couldn't agree with you more. And in all of the debates and the discussions that are happening nationally around education, our teachers must be leaders in that discussion. And because how can we have the conversation without that and have it be legitimate and relevant? But I also do want to say, and I'm looking over at the superintendent, I'm looking at First Lady Robin, and I do also want to say, I know she's doing some really great work around parents. And when we think about the ecosystem around the education of our children, part of what I think has to also be a priority of the Department of Education is to understand that you can't help a child without helping the family in which that child is being raised, right? And doing it to the point that you made earlier with the spirit of understanding and knowing that the vast majority of parents have a natural desire to raise their children well, but not always the skills and the resources to accomplish their goal. And so we have to also approach our work in that way, and it has to be a priority at the highest levels of leadership. And so everything from the education that has to be done around all of society, understanding the significance of third grade reading level, understanding the significance of a child being in school every day before the end of third grade if they're going to actually be able to catch up around comprehension. Because as all of you know, if a child by the end of third grade is not at third grade reading level, they literally drop off. Because before third grade, a child is learning how to read, then comprehension kicks in, and they're reading to learn. If they've not learned how to read, they cannot read to learn how, people walk on the moon, right? And so I do want to add that here, because I know there's so much work happening among the teachers and the educators on this dais around also focusing on parents and the communities that are raising our children, and just the need to also continue to support them.
Well, I've got bad news.
Oh, now?
It is that time. We've got to bring it to a close. And because this discussion is so important, and because we're at such an important brink here in South Carolina, we definitely could go on and on and on, but we've gotten the signal that it is time to conclude. Okay. Yes. But I would like to at least give our panelists an opportunity to just close us out. One powerful word you want to send with Senator Harris on the trail as she continues to fight for teachers. So if you guys could kind of think about that for a second. When I came out, I stumbled when I was trying to share Harlem by Langston Hughes that my second grade teacher taught me. And I channeled her, because just as I stumbled in second grade, I stumbled today, and I think I can do it again. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode We're on the verge of an explosion here in South Carolina. It's far time for us to take things to the next level. Our teachers deserve our best because they give us their best every day. And so I'd like for you all to definitely close us out with a word you'd like to share with Senator Harris. And we're actually going to start with Melissa, and then we're going to finish with you.
Well, I just want to say this. When Inez Tenenbaum was superintendent of education, we didn't have to have an all-in May 1 because she was all in. And we weren't 50th in education either. So it makes it different what your head does. And when your head matches your heart, you're going to have excellent outcomes in the classroom. That's number one. Senator Harris could have started her campaign with tax cuts for the wealthy. She could have started her campaign talking about the homeless situation. She could have talked about a new Green Deal or climate change, but she started with education. The first plan she launched was about education because she understands that education is the beginning of everything. You want to root out poverty? You educate children.
That's right.
You want better parents? You educate children.
Yes.
You want better outcomes? You educate children. And that's the beginning. We can't continue to pay $19,000 to incarcerate people.
That's right.
And $7,000 to educate people.
Yes.
You can't do that. We can't say that we value teachers and pay them 11% under the national average. And we can't say that we love our children if we don't offer them the ability to meet the goals that they set for themselves. So thank you, Senator Harris, for starting with education. And know that we love you and we're on your side. And when you are president, we can't wait to move South Carolina education forward.
You're up, Ms. Gregory.
Hard to follow that. So I'm also going to say a thank you. And you might remember when we spoke backstage that I said I'm a second-generation teacher. So my mom was a high school Spanish teacher for 38 years, I think, and was a single parent for most of my childhood. And she also worked multiple jobs. At the time in Greenville, there weren't a whole lot of Spanish teachers. There weren't really a need for them back then. And she taught night school to students who weren't enrolled in day school for various reasons. And she also taught Spanish courses to law enforcement officials at our local police department to earn extra money. And my grandmother moved in when I was little to help take care of me and also to help financially. And I remember my mom saying to me when I was really little, she said, you know, I hate to say this, but I feel like you're probably going to end up being a teacher. And she said, and I don't mean I hate to say that because I don't think it's a wonderful profession, because I do. And she did. She said, but it also just makes life hard in many ways. And she, as a parent, in general, you want your child's life to not be as hard as yours was. And so she always said that she felt this push and pull between wanting to encourage me to do something that she knew that I was passionate about and that she felt like was really important, but also wanting my life to be a little bit easier than hers had been. She would work in the summers as well, but when I was young, every so often she would step away from working in the summer and she would take students on a tour of England, France, and Spain. And that made life a little bit harder financially for us for a little bit because we didn't have that extra income. And when I got to be an adult, I asked her one time, I said, why did you do that? And she said, well, I always felt like teaching students another language and then allowing them to see another part of this world where that language was spoken and there were different cultures and different customs, made it a little less likely that those students would grow up to be narrow-minded adults. And she said, in that way, I felt like I was doing my part. She passed away 7 years ago, and I wish more than anything that she was here to hear what you have to say, because I think she would also really want to say thank you. So thank you.
And if you could close us out.
Ditto, ditto, ditto. Continue. You are a servant leader, and we are depending on you to be our voice and to lead the way. Tomorrow, teachers in our state are taking a very courageous and bold step. For many of them, it took them years to develop their voice, but they are following the encouragement that you have given them in order to find that voice and speak out for our children, because it all links back to the kids. We want you to have blessings on your pathway, and we always want you to vote for kids. Vote with conviction, to serve with integrity, and you're going to be okay. You're going to be okay, because we're going to be behind you. That's right. But always put the children first in everything that you do. Thank you so very much for this afternoon.
And local heroes, thank you. Thank you for putting the children first, and thank you for your constant and commitment, sacrifice to building a better tomorrow. Senator Harris, we are so out of time that I hate it, but would you like to close us out? Any final words? And we're going to wrap this thing up.
Just briefly, this has been a wonderful afternoon of discussion, and something that we should continue to elevate and highlight with the microphones that we all have, because our children rely on this, that we as their adults will do these kinds of things. And just to put a fine point on what you said, I believe very strongly that you can judge a society based on how it treats its children. And I also believe that there are very few expressions greater of love that a society can make toward its children than to invest in their education, and by extension, their teachers. And so that's what the subject is about. And I thank you all, everyone, for the love that you give our country, our neighborhoods, our communities, because it is truly an expression of love that you couple with your brilliant skills that are really creating our future. And so I thank you, I thank you, I thank you, and all of the educators in the room. Thank you.
Thank you.